sorts of tea about what's going on inside Washington, D.C., what regulators and lawmakers are thinking and working on, and what your credit union should be focused on in terms of risk areas and areas of opportunity. My name is Ann Petros, your host and Vice President of Regulatory Affairs here at NAFCU, and today I am joined by Mark Treichel, former Executive Director at NCUA and an examiner who now assists credit unions with the NCUA exam process. And Mark is an expert on all things NCUA, so we're glad to have him on the show today and to talk about a topic that is a focus area for every credit union, and that's examinations. And, exams should be the focus area for every institution because compliance with laws and regulations is important for a successful organization and ensuring your institution can grow. So let's dive into some exam topics. And again, thank you for being here with us, Mark.
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be able to speak with your audience and speak with you about what's going on at NCUA exam-wise and maybe other.
All right, excellent. So what are some recent trends that you have noticed about NCUA exams?
So one of the ways to kind of talk through that would be looking at CAMEL. I mean, everybody wants to get their CAMEL grade, CAMEL score when the exam's over. But under capital, under the gap equity that is now on the FPRs, you've got their net worth, which is what drives their real capital. But in the environment that we're in right now, with rates having gone up, investments are underwater. So the gap equity will take that into consideration. So there's a lot of credit unions that, for no fault of their own, went out and they have a big investment portfolio, and just with where rates have gone, anything that anybody has bought is worth a little bit less than it was when they bought it.
That's right.
So that creates some challenges. And while their CAMEL scores will be graded by their net worth, the gap can play into different things, like the Federal Home Loan Bank will look at that. It can impact mergers because of how that would have to be accounted for. Also, NCUA had the new capital regulation. They've had the new sub-debt rule. So that's been a hot topic, a good hot topic in that NCUA is approving more and more secondary capital or sub-debt. I think the ESIP program helped. That was,
right.
So there was so much volume there. That was such a tremendous opportunity that NCUA approved most of those. A lot of credit unions got a low-cost capital there, but it also got them more used to reviewing these packages for credit unions that are eligible for secondary capital. So asset quality, the challenge is on the investment portfolio. Credit unions reached a little bit longer to get a little bit better yield, and then with the way inflation took off, the Fed's trying to control inflation, and that's impacting the value of that portfolio quite deeply, which also can create some liquidity challenges because if they're accounting for those and hold to maturity in order to not have to book those so that it becomes part of their net worth, they have to have the ability to hold. So you throw into that the fact that share growth in the last quarter was marginal, as maybe 40 basis points in total.
Not what we were seeing during the pandemic.
Not what we were seeing during the pandemic. A lot of places had what came in the pandemic roll out and more. But if it's collectively 40 basis points, that means there's several credit unions that actually had shares go down because of inflation, because of people potentially having lost their job. But so on one side you've got investments that you need to hold, and on the other side you have the liquidity going out. And that can create, challenges in earnings if you have to slow down your loan production because you don't have the ability to fund those loans. So that's on the asset quality. That's on the earnings side. On the management side, cybersecurity. If I know you've chatted with all the 3 board members, but whenever I hear an NCUA board member heard what keeps you up at night, it's cybersecurity, right? So management is challenged in exams to make sure that they have those systems in place, which can be expensive. Also, the way NCUA approached their priority letter this year, there's 11 priorities. which is a pretty big increase from the last 2 years. And while they don't require enterprise risk management because they're adding more and more priorities, they're kind of, in my opinion, indirectly requiring
Suggesting
enterprise risk
that. Yeah.
management, which is it's a great, NCUA has a enterprise risk management program. It's something I started before I left at NCUA. And it's a good thing to have. And if credit unions have that, larger credit unions in particular, you can debate
Right.
what's large. It's good for credit unions to do that if they can afford to do it. And NCUA looks very positively on that. But it's been kind of my observation that while they don't require it, there's so many priorities that you might as well have an enterprise risk management program. And then corporate governance is really big. It's mandatory at the ones credit unions to have strong corporate governance. Even those credit unions that hit the levels below that and below that, you're just seeing it trickle in more and more as something that NCUA will hit pretty hard on the credit union if there's things that management at the credit union is doing that maybe the board should have been more aware of. And then NCUA will take that opportunity to point out that you need to have good corporate governance in place, good policies in place to make sure that the board is aware of what's going on.
Right.
There's what's required under the regulation for the board to be involved in, and there's what maybe they want to be involved with, and then there's what management wants to be involved with, and all that kind of works into good corporate governance. Liquidity, though, I mentioned liquidity. I'm hearing a lot of chatter around that recently from my clients and from potential clients.
Definitely.
And through I've one of the things I'm doing as part of my consulting is when other NCUA folks retire. I had the advantage of moving all over the country and serving in a lot of different jobs, and so I know a lot of good people at NCUA or good people who left NCUA. But I approached them if they have if I enjoyed working with them at NCUA and they were really talented and they had some skill sets that I thought would help credit unions, I'm connecting with them and they're helping me help my clients. And so they're hearing different things out there on the liquidity front that seems like things are tightening up, both from an exam perspective, Federal Home Loan Bank perspective, and the like. So I think that's going to be big in 2023 as well. And I would say just a general statement. So when I was at NCUA, I'd go to a NAFCU meeting or I'd go to a CUNA meeting or a league meeting, and the representatives would come up and say, hey, so there's an issue in this one part of the country and someone's kind of being a little overzealous and examiners being a little overzealous, and we, what can you do about it? And we would always say, hey, we need specifics. If, we have a zero tolerance on reprisals, zero tolerance on overstepping bounds and all that. But there would be a reluctance to, for the names to come forward because they were afraid of retaliation.
Right.
And so I would hear that, but our only response could be if we don't have specifics, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
And so now that I've changed teams and I'm on the other side and I hear more about that, but I also hear it from a perspective where it's not actually the retaliation side of it. It's every time NCUA has a conversation and says, I think you should do X, whether it's a document resolution or examiner finding something that might actually go into the report, there's this dialogue where they may be referencing best practices or have you considered doing this? And so every time a CEO or a staff member at a credit union has to hear that, they're kind of at a fork in the road. And one of my clients said it better than I could. He said, you have to decide if you're going to go along to get along. And so you have the situation where NCUA could give you 5 things that you want to do, and you might want to do 3, slam dunk. It's like, these are great ideas. I'm going to implement them. The other 2, you might say, one of those is too expensive. I think it's a little overzealous and I don't want to do it. And you may choose to have a dialogue with them on it or not, or because they're in that regulatory role. I think in some instances, credit unions feel like there's a little bit of pressure to accept what's in the report and what's being recommended. So that's been eye-opening for me to realize, it's not retaliation, it's not overstepping, it's the 2 sides trying to work together, but there is this a little bit of a pressure on the staff to say, okay, well, how might NCUA respond if I push back on this, right? So.
Yeah, we certainly hear that a lot from our members. So, it's I guess heartening to, to
It's
see
real.
that you're right. Yeah,
It's
it
real.
is happening. And so you mentioned the Federal Home Loan Banks. I'm assuming that you're referring to this net tangible equity
Yes.
issue,
Yes.
which we've been hearing from some members about as well. And really, it's a federal housing finance agency rulemaking that sort of makes this difficult and puts the onus on the NCUA to issue a waiver
Right.
in instances where credit union capital may not be at the level that it should be under the rule. But considering the unique economic circumstances that we're in, what do you think the NCUA should do here? And as far as I understand it, this has never actually come to pass, but could.
It hasn't come to pass recently. There have been maybe 10 or 15 years ago, there were some situations where NCUA was asked to accept it. And back then, when they did accept it, they would put some restrictions in place. So it was, if you're going to do this, you might have to curtail doing A, B, and C.
Okay.
You might need to add, some staff to do one particular thing. It's usually not NCUA will just say, boom, yeah, okay, it's all right.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same token, if you get down to that if it's approaching negative tangible net equity, which the other as an aside there, you could have goodwill from mergers and different things. So it's not just the investments. If you had a lot of mergers, and the goodwill plays into that, so that's probably what's tricking or tripping the wire that's pushing people into that. NCUA will look at what's making that up too, and that they also have an understanding of how how cooperative and what kind of working relationship they've had with that particular credit union too. So there's that relationship that can come into play, and if you've got a lot of goodwill with NCUA because of the history that you've had with them, that could bode well. I have also heard quite recently that at least one of the Federal Home Loan Bank areas has started something where they've actually put some institutions on a watch list if their gap equity is less than half of their total equity.
Oh.
And now, what watch list, you double secret probation,
Right.
and what
No.
what exactly does that mean? But they've alerted some institutions to that effect. So, and that's short of the tangible negative net equity. So maybe that's just they're creating a list so that they can start watching these folks to see if there's any changes in any authorizations.
Sure,
I will say,
sure.
in my experience, Federal Home Loan Bank has always been, very cooperative with credit unions. It was always someone that my team and I always would like to work with when credit unions started having some challenges. Like you said, it's something they have to do. It's in the law. So they tend to be very reasonable in working with credit unions as they get up to that point. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And some credit unions have also expressed concerns about the NCUA's recent guidance on the net economic value supervisory test, and that the additional flexibility regarding interest rate risk really doesn't go far enough. So, what are your thoughts on the guidance, considering where we're at economically and the pressures that credit unions are facing with respect to liquidity and interest rate risk?
So I'm not. I like the NEV test, and I hate the NEV test at the same time. It's kind of a rough justice approach but by putting it in place, NCUA had a standard way that they could look at everybody comparable, right? Because they like to do a statistical analysis and say, okay, who are the outliers? And if we value core shares at this, and we lock everybody into this, because that's kind of the biggest driver, that's the assumption that can really change the data. If we lock that number up and shock the rest of the balance sheet, we can see who may have the biggest potential problems and where we may need to spend a little bit of time. Now, the one good thing they did with the changes was anybody who became extreme risk had to get a document resolution under the old rules.
Right.
And so I'd heard anecdotally that most capital market specialists who for month after month, when rates started going up, when all the assignments that the capital market specialists were getting was going into places that had hit extreme, and they were having to work out a document resolution on a plan that would help get them out of extreme when there really wasn't any unsafe and unsound things in place. And one of the other challenges with NEV is it locks that down, to one variable on the core shares, and it shocks everything else. And then once it's all shocked 300 basis points and rates go up, it anticipates that it's going to do that again. And how likely is that? So it kind of double penalizes you. It also doesn't give you credit for if you have really good capital. It doesn't give you credit if you have very low expense and if you have, stellar asset quality. So it focuses on one thing, which is why I kind of call it kind of a rough justice. It was good that they got away from requiring a document resolution, which pushes it back into the arena where virtually everything else is, which is examiner judgment, which is better than an automatic door. I mean, you can still run into some challenges there if you don't agree with the examiner's judgment, but it's a better place for it to be. And many of the staff at NCUA didn't really want to issue the door. They were kind of painted into kind of like the reg on the negative tangible net equity, right? Here's the rule.
Your hands are sort of tied.
I have to follow it. So taking that off of the requirement for the examiners was a really good thing. Now, if you go back and listen to the public hour-long webinar that NCUA did when they did it, they also released their scope workbook, and they may have touched on it there, but their scope workbook expanded. So while they took away here, they actually added exam steps in the scope workbook. So the belief that maybe they didn't do enough, they actually added some things, which it doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it's because of the environment they're in. And I think some of the things they learned, they added some steps there so credit unions can maybe expect some new questions and a little bit more there. But I will say, even the plans that were having to be submitted, generally speaking, NCUA was being very reasonable as far as not making credit unions take draconian steps so that they couldn't properly serve their members.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard from some members concerns about, not giving enough weight to like non-maturity deposits and things like that. And just, how this is going to apply to CAMEL scores, and any thoughts there?
Well, so every quarter NCUA does their share insurance briefing, and I like that briefing because they put up the trends in CAP. They have two charts in there where they talk about what's going on in the trends in CAMEL, and they're at all-time lows. There's nowhere for them to go but up. There's no at the last one there's no code 4 or code 5 credit unions over $1 billion, which is good for credit unions and it's good for the insurance fund. There were maybe 12 credit unions over $1 billion that are code 3, and that number I know is going to start slipping, partially because of what's going on in liquidity and net economic value. It can impact their CAMEL codes. If it's going from a 1 to a 2, I mean, most people are comfortable being a 1 or a 2.
Right.
It's when you slip into a 3, it can get onerous because NCUA is going to be showing up twice as much at least. And, the cost ramifications of NCUA being there and the care and feeding of an exam and having to get all the documents ready twice.
It's a lot of resources.
It is a big regulatory burden.
Right.
So that, stay on the side of a 2 is really where you want to be. But I would, I think if you've got a good plan, if you've got reasonable capital, and your NEV is less than stellar, there are ways you can explain to NCUA that it is safe and sound. And I've seen extreme rated credit unions get very good CAMEL codes. So it really comes down to what the facts are individually and the ability to communicate that well, to the examiner. But the examiners seem relatively open to have that dialogue in the cases I've seen.
Yeah, that's good to hear. So, I mean, a credit union could demonstrate that their own internal modeling and analysis paints a different picture than what the examiners are thinking.
Yeah. And I mean, NEV is rough justice. It's what they have to use to try and just compare everybody to everything. But a good model that a credit union has done that shows that they've mitigated the risk. If you've got a capital market specialist in there looking at it, they're going to prefer to look at your model to see what you understand, because
That's tailored to your
it's
institution.
tailored to
Yeah.
your institution. And again, the staff knows what NEV's limitations are.
Right.
So, so I would push back on that about my own particular plan. And if you're having to put a plan together to reduce your risk from high or lower to high, don't don't paint yourself into a corner by saying I'm going to do 10 things when you really should only want to do 3, and those 3 might be
Sure.
enough.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good advice. How did the shift to virtual examinations during the pandemic, affect NCUA's ability to oversee credit unions? Obviously, that's not something that had ever really been done before.
Right.
And then, the pandemic changed a lot, and there was really no choice but to start, relying on virtual examinations. So, how did it affect their ability to oversee credit unions? And do you think that examiners' focus areas have changed at all?
So, that's that's one of the silver linings of the pandemic, is everybody realizes there's more things that can be done offsite. Before before the pandemic, I believe it was Keith Morton in his region, we did some piloting of trying to do more and more offsite
Right.
things and
Mm-hmm.
steps, right? And it was interesting because we, with NCUA having a union and the things that you have there, so doing that pilot, there were certain examiners who were like, no, I got to go on site. I'm going to go on site. I don't want to be part of the pilot, and I need to be there. I want to go there. And there were others who were more open to having the appetite to trying to do some things offsite. So the NCUA started to gather some steps that could be done offsite. Then the pandemic hit, and shattered the exam process, and everything had to be done offsite, which I think taught NCUA that pick a number, is it 20 or 40 or 60% of the things that we thought had to be done on site really don't have to be on site. And so I think they're going to fully embrace that so that they can have less travel time, better quality of life, examiner turnover because of travel. One thing NCUA does is when the examiners quit, they have a voluntary, why are you leaving? Travel and quality of life was always number one. So if they can keep their people at home, it's better for them because they'll stay around longer, and it's better for the credit unions potentially if
Some
you don't.
consistency, right? Same
Exactly.
examiner.
Exactly. The consistency of the examiner, and not having to have 4 offices for NCUA on for 2 or 3 weeks, and not having them on site. Now, the focus, I will say, from my clients, generally speaking, everybody was supportive. I mean, just the world, where we were at in the world, everybody's like, yeah, we realize you need to do it this way. I will say that in general, it appeared like NCUA was asking for more documentation. So if it was on site and they asked for 3 feet of documents, now they're asking for 4 or 5. And so the burden of getting those ready, the burden of turning those into electronic files, the challenge of them learning, how to look at those electronically. I mean, when I started as an examiner, I had to look at some loans on microfiche, right? And
Oh, wow.
I always liked the hard files
Yeah.
because it wasn't fun, right?
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that that's happened, and I think it also then created some elongation in exam time. So maybe it takes, I don't know, pick a number.
We were hearing that at
Yeah.
the beginning, definitely, and that there were sometimes duplicative requests for documentation,
Right.
and
Yeah.
I think it was just communication breakdown,
Right. Yeah.
and among examiners.
Yes, and the communication, I think every which way, the communication is more challenging. So it's taking a little bit longer. And I mean, it's like, should NCUA have all their staff back in the building, or do you only have to be in halftime? Not even talking about an exam, but I always enjoyed, if I was on the 7th floor walking down to the 3rd floor to go to HR to ask something, and I ran into somebody from E&I along the way, I saw him. It's like, oh, that reminds me, I need to ask you X, right? So you lose that a little bit of that ability to communicate kind of impromptu. And I think the same thing happens in the exam. At the end, examiners are packing up. They stop by and see the CEO, or they stop by and see the CFO and can ask a couple things.
Something may come up, just
Right.
spur of the moment.
Right. Yeah. And then the other thing is, if I have to do it all by email, that you can spend an hour and a half writing an email that you might have been able to just have a 5-minute conversation, and then that email can be misinterpreted on
Exactly.
well,
Things can get
what
lost in
exactly,
translation.
yeah, give me everything on X, right? So
Right.
what did that mean?
Right.
But all of this it's kind of a grand experiment. How do they get to, to the new state, whatever that might be, when they can decide what has to be done on site and off site?
Right. Well, NAFCU has been advocating for a hybrid exam posture. I mean, we think that that is the best path forward, because we've heard from our members that there are certainly a lot of efficiencies and benefits to the virtual process. But like you were saying, it is really nice to have that on-site presence, just not for the entire time.
Right. Right.
And so we've gotten a bit of the perception that the NCUA is maybe a little unwilling to move in that direction or commit to that fully. Why do you think that might be?
Well, once they commit, it's hard to uncommit, right?
Right.
I mean, it's kind of like when
There's no going back.
There's no going back. It's like when NCUA started doing budget briefings or hearings the first time 20 years ago. And I asked Lynn Skiles at the time, I said, so once you do this, you got to do it forever.
Oh, there is no going back.
And then the other thing is, I guess there are no absolutes, right? So once they commit that, okay, we won't spend more than half our time. There may be situations where they need to spend more than half their time, or we will only do these 5 steps on site, and these other ones we'll try and do off site. Inevitably, there's going to be some situations where it makes sense for them to have to be on site, and particularly the smaller the credit union is, there's a value to being there, both from a consulting perspective, but also from the trust but verify. There is a psychological benefit to the exam actually having some element of being on site, because of it's like the cities that will leave an empty police car, on a road, right? What do you do when you see that? You slow down. When you I use Waze for my GPS. When it says police reported ahead, right, I look at my speedometer and I slow down. So it reminds you, and that you're there, and so there is just an intrinsic value to some part of the exam being on site, which
Absolutely.
is why I think
amplifies the pressure of the situation.
Exactly. But I think they're never going to go back to the way they did it before. There's the budget pressure for the travel costs, which are going up and up and up. So will there be I think they've committed to doing somewhat virtual on nearly everything that they can, but will there be a policy statement on it saying that they're doing it?
Right.
I might if I was there, I might shy away from doing that, at least until I had more data.
That's fair. Yeah. So let's talk about another, recent change in the examination process, and that's the deployment of merit. So has the implementation of merit, in your opinion, been successful so far? And how do you think it's changed the way examiners are interacting with credit union staff, especially in the virtual environment?
So I think it's a net positive from what I've heard. Aries needed to go away because it was built on
legacy systems.
Legacy systems that hadn't been supported in 5, 10, pick a number, years.
Right.
So it needed to change. It was a legacy debt that needed to be fixed. But the 2 biggest positives that I've heard is one from the credit union side. If I have a document resolution and it has 5 items on it, and fix your commercial lending policy, do this on BSA, and some third investment policy change or something. Under Aries, there was no way in the system for NCUA to say, okay, the commercial loan policy is fixed, right? The way they've built that, if they go in and they do a follow-up exam, they can actually log off that, okay, this is fixed and it's resolved, so there are no longer 3 issues here. There's two
Mm-hmm.
issues here, and it's much better tracking internally.
So sort of a running log.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of the things that were in Word document type things that really couldn't be tracked in
Mm-hmm.
Aries can be tracked internally by NCUA, which actually helps the ability to be offsite too, because if they can have better systems and better data, then they can ask more precise questions and perhaps not need to be on site. The other big advantage is that if you have a team exam and you have three examiners working on loan exceptions and you have someone else working on something else, there's better collaboration behind the scenes so that the examiner in charge can see what examiner A, B, and C did that day, and it flows in better. And that's a big help on the NCUA side of managing the exam process, which ultimately makes it more efficient. Now, the goal was that would have been launched before I retired 2.5 years, and then it got slowed down a little bit, which what somebody said, IT projects always cost more and take longer, and that was true.
Mm-hmm.
But the pandemic slowed it down, and they needed to get their staff trained. But I think all in all, it's a net positive on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've seen with the most recent budget that there's a significant increase in costs to merit, and it's understandable because some of it is difficult to project out and estimate, and I think that's just like you said, sort of the nature of anything IT and
Yes,
cybersecurity
yes.
related. But it is a little concerning because obviously that's all credit union
It's
dollars.
credit union dollars. But it's not gonna go away. And it's, what is it? O&M. I can't even remember what O&M, but it's the maintenance of the
Hmm.
operations and maintenance maybe, that once you build it, there's a certain percentage that to keep it up and running and to
Sure.
keep it moving and to potentially add things. I know I couldn't
Additional
remember.
features,
Yeah,
upgrades, things
additional
like that.
features. It's built to do that. They built it to handle the S and camels, so because
Right,
they knew
right.
that was coming, so that under the old system there was no way of tracking the
Hmm.
S. So
Yeah. Have you seen any downsides to the implementation of merit?
I don't think there's any downsides. I think you could say it cost a decent amount of money, right?
Hmm.
But I think that was a sunk cost. I think that was a fixed cost.
Hmm.
And could have they done a little bit different here and a little bit different there, and saved a little bit of money, perhaps. But I think in the end it does what they set it out to do, and I think it
Hmm.
will do more down the road from some of the things I've heard them
The
say. So
benefits will hopefully
yeah,
outweigh the costs
yep.
and to the future. So, um, you know, bigger picture question: how well does the NCUA do at accurately communicating exam trends and priorities to credit unions? Now that you're on the other side of this, do you think that more clarity might be needed on on some of the guidance and priorities that come out of the agency?
Well, I think you could always have more clarity. So let me say that. I will say, Chairman Todd Harper was in charge of public and congressional affairs.
That's right.
He's a
Hmm.
very good communicator. So I think he's brought some things in play that has NCUA perhaps taking some additional steps and making sure that there's a little bit more clarity in some of the things that come out. I will say, one of the things when I talk to clients or potential clients, one of my clients called me the NCUA interpreter, and so there are situations where I have someone explaining an exam report to me, and it says something in the English language that's very clear what it means in the English language,
Hmm.
and the credit union thinks it means this, but in my mind I know that that's being written that way because of a certain instruction that might not be public. It's just kind of the inner workings of different things that it's like, well, okay, they said that
Sure.
means their next step is going to be this, and you might need to think of this. And I don't know how necessarily that could be communicated better. I know one of the biggest challenges that I saw and is so that the board sets the policy and what they want to do, right? And the executive director's job is to make sure that staff implement that.
Hmm.
Everybody with all good intent and goodwill wants that to work its way down. But it's kind of like the game of telephone. If it's issued here And then the executive director talks to the regional directors and says, okay, this is out there. You need to start doing it. Let me know how it goes. And the regional director talks to the associate regional directors who go talk to the supervisory examiner.
Things
By the
make
time
it
the examiner gets to
lost,
it,
or yeah.
and then the examiner looks at it and says, well, I only have 5 hours of office time to read all my mail. Maybe I didn't read that one by the time I went in and did the exam. So that's just a huge, challenge that I know that NCUA has done. We would do quarterly webinars internally. Debbie Matt started that, and as a chairman webinar, I took it over, and then different board members have done it internally. So they're doing more to try and do communications, but you can never do too much, I think. And in the other challenges in governmentese, sometimes you think you're being clear, and then you might not. And the other piece is you might be clear, but there might be an unintended consequence that you hadn't really thought of, that once you get it. It's I guess a good example of that would be if you're extreme, you're going to get a document resolution, right? That sat there as a policy from 2016, and it never came up until rates went up this year. And then, NAFCU raised it, credit unions were raising it. I was talking to NCUA behind the scenes, and it was, that was a very good example of the collaborative nature of trade groups and credit unions reaching out and say, hey, this is broken, and and how NCUA responded to that, which was communication, and it clarified that communication. So I think the intent is good. It's just always such a challenge.
That's fair. I mean, well-intended policies that are put in place to, protect the share insurance fund may end up, being too harsh and sort of blanket solutions when you really need a more tailored approach that's understanding of different circumstances.
And even like the regulations, I kind of look at regulations as a 3-act play. You have the proposal and the preamble, and then you have the final rule and the preamble. But if you don't read the preambles to the rule where the board explains why they're doing particular things, oftentimes the clarity is actually in the preamble or the two preambles, and all NCUA staff members might not always read all that as they're deciding it, because if you look at the regulation over here that's in black and white, they're saying, no, it's got to be this, but there are subtle nuances that are explained in the preamble.
Right. Yeah. Well, my team and I here at NAFCU live in the preambles of the rulemaking process. So we certainly appreciate the value of rationale and explanations provided there. So let's close out with a sort of forward-looking question. If you could look into your crystal ball, what should credit unions expect in terms of supervisory priorities for the new year?
So let's do two things. I'll talk about what's in place right now. I'm going to look at my cheat sheet here because they do have 11 priorities.
It's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of. And I talk about this a lot when I go out and chat with credit unions, but I kind of break their priorities into 3 categories. There's perpetual priorities, there's occasional priorities, and there's new priorities. So this last letter, which came out, had 3 new priorities, which were payment systems, which was number 3, capital, which was number 5, and loan participations, which was number 8. Now, payment systems, fintech, everybody loves
surprising
fintech.
That's on
Everybody
there.
wants fintech. You've got all these different systems that are interrelating with credit union systems. Credit unions need to embrace this because it's the future. But I think NCUA wants to try and understand what that might mean for the risks of cyber, what it might mean for the risks of other problems that could, with all these systems
It's been a huge spike in fraud.
Right. And they don't know what they don't know. So they added regional payment system specialists this last year. I believe they've got some of them hired now. So that's something that, while it's out there communicated in a priority, I don't think credit unions really had to deal with it because they didn't have the staff, but they're starting to get the staff. So that could be something you'd see in 2023. Capital, we talked a little bit about that. They had it on there because of the new risk-based capital rule, the leverage ratio counting for complex credit unions. That's why they put that on there. Right. Loan participations were growing through the roof. And so that was something they knew they wanted to take a look at. And I would say they have been taking a close look at that. The perpetual credit risk. So credit risk management was number one. That's always going to be on there. I would say they probably put it at number one which it was number one the year before. They probably put it there because of the fear of what's going to come out of the pandemic and job losses in the economy. Now, asset quality is very strong. Delinquency is very low, so that hasn't been an issue. Mm-hmm. But they did they did change their priority ladder to cover every specific type of loan and having kind of an exhaustive plan on those, which usually they would either say do it for commercial loans or do it for real estate. They really kind of went all in on that one. Cyber will always be on there. Bank Secrecy Act, they are adding 4 or 5 or 6. They've proposed adding 4 or 5 or 6 positions to the Office of Examination and Insurance, creating a specialist in the regions for Bank Secrecy Act. Mm-hmm. Now, you could take this one of two ways, that's a first step towards them maybe having more exam steps on it, or you could view it as they want a career ladder for the people who are good in that so that they have a specialty that they can mm-hmm. get promoted to and raise the bar. Because credit unions tend to like working with a specialist, so it's a good thing. And I think it's more that it's probably a career path than it being, a land grab on a bigger footprint on mm-hmm. the exam cycle.
Also, not a surprising, area to see more focus when you think about what's happened with crypto and the rise in digital assets, and that poses some BSA AML concerns.
It sure does. Yeah, boy, this has been an interesting year in crypto. I'm recording a podcast tomorrow with someone on what happened on FTX and what that might mean for blockchain and
yes,
that.
The
By
fallout.
the way, I'm going to take that as a plug for I've got a podcast. It's called With Flying Colors. The title comes from having content that will try and assist credit unions to pass their exam with flying colors, and I interview different folks around the industry, but I also interview my specialists that work for me on particular hot topics, mm-hmm. which gets me to probably what I think maybe the biggest priority might be for this year. I did a 2-part podcast with a person on my team, Todd Miller, who was a capital market specialist and a director of special actions, on how we find ourselves in the liquidity situation we're in now. And then the second one has a lot of meaty recommendations on what credit unions might want to do if they find themselves anywhere on the liquidity spectrum. Todd kind of shared a lot of wisdom on things along those lines. But I believe the liquidity tied to the net economic value mm-hmm. challenges, and with inflation where it's at, with unemployment potentially going up, with share growth going away, or there's this new kind of groundswell of that being a potential challenge. And liquidity is kind of like breathing. You think you're okay on it, and it's like your body just does it and you don't even think about it.
Right.
But when you're short of oxygen or you're short of liquid funds, you notice real quick, and every decision
becomes dire.
Every situation that you have to make is related to that, and then mm-hmm. everything kind of becomes interrelated. So I think they're going to hit that hard. So the interesting piece of the priority ladder, what I always tried to do when I was there, is if you're going to have 11 priorities, you should put the most important one first and the least important one 11th. Now, they may or may not do that, but it's a general way to approach, the structure of a letter. The 11th priority was liquidity and interest rate risk. So they had credit risk number 1, which is where they thought things might need to be focused.
Right.
They had liquidity and interest rate risk on there, but they actually had them flip-flopped on what happened because of, trying to control inflation and driving rates up. So it's put credit unions and banks in a quite interesting situation right now. So I think they'll be hitting that pretty hard.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you're probably right on that. All right. Well, that does it for our discussion of examinations on this episode. And thank you, Mark, so much for joining me. And if you enjoy watching or listening to the CUPP, please subscribe to our podcast, hit the notifications icon so you get alerted of new episodes, or hit the like button, and leave us a review on your favorite streaming platform. We'd also love to hear from you on new topics that you'd like us to discuss on this episode, on the next episode of the CUPP. So with that, thank you again, Mark, and for our viewers and listeners, until next time.